In this video, I'm going to discuss the overall structure and function of your respiratory system. So certainly the most important function of the respiratory system is the air exchange that occurs between the lungs and the environment. And we need this air exchange in order to have the gas exchange that will occur between the air and the circulating bloodstream. This gas exchange allows oxygen to reach body cells and carbon dioxide, a waste product, to be given off. But the respiratory system also is involved in production of sound, such as the sound of my voice as you're hearing in this video. And it brings in the chemicals that our olfactory receptors, our sense of smell, can determine things around us. The respiratory system is also essential in several homeostatic processes that we'll discuss a little bit later, things like the acid-base balance of your blood, the overall water balance of your body, and your overall body temperature regulation. The respiratory system can further be divided into an upper and lower section. Your upper respiratory tract includes everything that is above your thoracic cavity, so it's the things found in your head and neck. And that, of course, will include your nasal cavity, everything that's involved in your oral cavity around your mouth, and then down into the trachea, which is kind of the bottom of it before the lungs are reached. The upper respiratory system has two important functions. The first is to condition the incoming air. That means to make it warmer and more humid. This allows the gas exchange to occur when that air reaches your lungs and the alveoli inside the lungs. Inside your nasal cavity, you have certain protrusions or like little shelves that stick out that help slow down this airflow, as well as the sinus cavities that the air has to travel through as it moves from the outside of the body, coming in through your nostrils and then down the trachea into your lungs. And slowing down the airflow just allows more time for that warming and humidifying to occur. The second important function of your upper respiratory tract is to filter out any airborne pathogens or irritants that may be present on the air. You have hairs just inside your nose, inside your nasal cavity to help trap small particles. There are special cells called goblet cells that produce mucus that line the upper respiratory tract, or at least the nasal cavity, to trap these small particles, to collect the bacteria, viruses, fungi, dust. And then the cells of the nasal cavity and other parts of your respiratory system actually move this mucus along down to where it can be swallowed and then digested. So the high acid content of your stomach helps break down any bacteria that may have traveled into your body through that inhalation of air. So just looking in a little more detail at the nasal cavity, these are the little shelves I was talking about. They're either called turbinates or conchae, and they just, again, provide more surface area to help warm the air, slow down the air passages. And then you can see, we have another slide later with better pictures, but you can see these sinuses are basically spaces inside the bones. There are 4 of them in your facial bones, along with having, and of course there are going to be openings so the air can go in and come out here, and the various sinuses. We just can't see it from this cross-section. But the sinuses, along with helping condition the air, they also lighten the weight of the bones of your skull. They provide some resonance to your voice, probably give people better singing voices if they've got bigger sinuses. And there's some theory that they may also help prevent damage to the face because it's kind of a crumple zone. If you do get hit in the face, the bones will crumple into the sinuses. Here's an actual skull. You can see that the nose that would be here, most of your nose is cartilage. So the bones of the face are more flat in line with your face where the bones actually end. And then these are the turbinates, or the little shelves that stick out inside that nasal cavity. Here's another perspective on the sinuses. The maxillary sinuses are the largest. These are the ones that often people feel pressure under their eyes when they have a sinus headache. If you happen to get an infection, the mucus that's produced inside these sinuses is really a place for bacteria, a lot of good food for bacteria, so they grow there. Of course, it's warm and humid as well. And so if the sinuses then get clogged because of bacterial growth and mucus production, that's why you're getting pain, because things are building up inside these sinuses at various parts of various parts on your skull. But again, they are all open, so this is showing you more, air will come in the nose and be able to go into the sinus and come back out of the sinuses and travel around before it actually reaches the lungs. Just thinking again about that ciliated epithelium, we can see on this slide, the cilia are these little finger-like projections that are coming out of the cells. So there's just, many, many little fingers here that are moving. They move to move the mucus. In this case, these are ones from the lower respiratory system that are moving it up towards the pharynx, or this is where you're going to be swallowing into your stomach. Of course, in your nasal cavity, they'll be moving it down towards the pharynx. So the pharynx is a dual purpose part of the body. It's really everything from your nasal cavity to down below the trachea, entrance to the trachea. So it's the back of the throat, and it can be divided into the nasopharynx, or what's around the nose, the oropharynx, the parts that's around your mouth, and then the hypopharynx, or the laryngeal pharynx, the one that's just above the voice box. So the pharynx receives air when you breathe. Whether it's coming from your nose or your mouth, it's going to travel through the pharynx to get to your trachea. And it's also going to receive food, because food, of course, comes in your mouth and has to go down to your esophagus, which actually is right here behind your trachea. So if you swallow something, you're taking something in, it's going to go down this pathway, my red arrow, whereas air is going to be the blue pathway. In order to ensure that air goes down the trachea and food goes down the esophagus, there's an important flap of cartilage called the epiglottis that we can see right here that actually can act as a lid to close off the trachea. So when you swallow, this is not a particularly good diagram to show this, but your larynx, your voice box, will actually go up when you swallow. If you put your hand on your throat and try swallowing, you'll see that part of your throat rises up. So it goes up as you swallow, and that will connect the edge of the trachea with the epiglottis, with this piece of cartilage, and close off your trachea so that you can swallow food down the esophagus and not get it down your trachea or your windpipe by mistake. Of course, sometimes you can swallow too quickly, or perhaps you're laughing at the same time and you don't get a good coverage of the epiglottis, and that's when you get those coughing fits, because a little bit of some food particles or some liquid has gotten into the trachea and your lungs are responding, trying to get it out. So the larynx, the voice box, is found between the pharynx and the trachea, and it's about 9 pieces of cartilage to keep the top of the trachea open for breathing and to also allow us to speak. These are just showing you several views on that trachea, and I just wanted to point out again, your epiglottis here is sort of that upper lid and it's cartilage, and then you can feel the kind of this larger structure in the front. That's what you can actually feel in the front of your throat. Male people can feel it better because they just have a larger larynx, because they have a deeper voice and just need stronger cartilage, so it's thicker and bigger. And then we go down into the trachea, where you can see again we've got rings of cartilage that provide structure, so that pathway of air is always going to be open, so that you're always able to get the air you need. Then as you enter the thoracic cavity, you're moving into the lower respiratory tract. Again, starting with the trachea and then moving down into the bronchial system in your lungs, which again will culminate in the alveoli, which is where the actual gas exchange will occur. You have a lung on the right and the left side of your body, and all of them are enclosed by the thoracic cavity. Because your heart is a little bit more to the left than the right, the left lung only has 2 lobes, 2 distinct areas, whereas your right lung has 3. But there really is not a huge difference in how much air capacity there is in either lungs. There is less in the left lung, but it's not a huge difference. Around your lungs, there are membranes. We have what's known as the pleural membrane. There's basically 2 layers of the pleural membrane. One is stuck really tight to lung tissue. The other one is stuck to the interior of the thoracic cavity. And then there is a thin fluid-filled space in between. And your lungs themselves are surrounded by the ribs, which have intercostal muscles between the ribs, and the diaphragm goes across the whole bottom section, touches the bottom of the lungs, goes from one side of your body, one side of your rib, to the other, and across the lumbar vertebrae in the back. So here's just a diagram showing you. Here's your diaphragm that goes all the way across, and very important in breathing that we'll talk in another video. You can see how the diaphragm is attached to the lumbar video by a pretty strong connection of connective tissue. And then your lungs are pretty tightly connected to the thoracic cavity. This is where this double layer of membrane, one on the lung itself and then one on kind of the interior of the cavity with a little bit of fluid in between, allowing both membranes to slide back and forth across each other as you breathe. So the trachea is a flexible tube that goes from the larynx, from the bottom of the voice box into the thoracic cavity, made up of about 20 C-shaped pieces of cartilage. It's hyaline cartilage specifically. And so the cartilage would, here's the C shape looking at the trachea. And then this space in the back is not filled with cartilage because the esophagus sits right here. And so the trachea is held open all the time by these rings of cartilage, whereas the esophagus is flat until a bolus of food is swallowed. And at that point, the esophagus expands in all directions and actually will expand into the trachea a little bit. So we have this small section where the cartilage is not present. It's a softer tissue, and so that esophagus can bulge kind of into the edge of the trachea when you're swallowing food. Your trachea divides into two bronchi, the right bronchus and the left bronchus, before they enter the lungs to go along with a right and a left lung. So we call this collection of bronchi from your trachea on down the bronchial tree, and it goes from the trachea all the way down to the alveoli. There is cartilage in the bronchi, the first thicker branches, we can say. But as things get smaller and smaller, working down to those tiny air sacs at the bottom, we get less and less cartilage, but we get more and more muscle. So we start off with sort of lots of cartilage, not much muscle, and we get down to lots of muscle and not any cartilage. In the upper section of your bronchial tree, you also have ciliated cells again, like you see in the nasal cavity. And in this case, the cells are moving mucus up to the pharynx to be swallowed instead of sort of down to the pharynx to be swallowed. The actual function of gas exchange is only going to happen at the alveoli, at the alveolar sacs, just like the function of transferring oxygen and nutrients and carbon dioxide from the bloodstream in cells only happens in the capillary beds. So we have to get down to the really small, thin layered, tiny microscopic structures to actually have anything happen. All of these tubes that are in your lungs that are carrying air are just a pathway to move the air down to the most important part. Here's an X-ray of the bronchial tree. So you can see, here's coming in the trachea and then dividing into the right and left bronchus, and then down to very smaller bronchi, into the bronchioles, the little tiny ones, and then the alveoli would be down here at the end, kind of like little sections of grapes. You can kind of think of it that way, little air sacs at the bottom. So these alveoli are actually single squamous epithelium. So they are a single layer of flat cells that are lying in capillary beds. So they are surrounded by blood vessels. The single layer of cells that make up the alveoli match a single layer of cells that make up the capillary wall, and there's just a membrane in between. So you've got your cells of the alveoli, a membrane, and then the cells of the capillaries. They're really stacked right on top of each other so that gases such as oxygen and carbon dioxide can kind of quickly move back and forth across all of these cells. Your alveoli are made of 3 different types of cells. There are the cells in the alveolar wall. They're known as type 1 cells, and they are this squamous epithelium. Then we have cells that produce surfactant, because remember, the air is coming in moist, and in order for the gas, so if we say, this is the air out here, these are our gas particles, in order for gas to move into cells, it actually has to dissolve in a layer of liquid. And so there has to be a layer of liquid on the outside of the alveoli, and again on the inside of the alveoli. This all has to be very moist in order for that gas to kind of stay dissolved in the water and in that liquid and to move into the blood cells. And so If you think of an alveoli like being a plastic bag, if it is wet, if you have a wet plastic bag, you know the two sides want to stick together. And you don't want that to happen in your lungs. And so surfactant is a lipid. It is a fat substance, a fatty substance, and it is produced by special cells known as type 2 cells to put into these, to keep the two sides of your alveoli from collapsing in on each other. So it keeps them from sticking together, and surfactant is really, really important. It's one of the last things that's produced before birth, and so often if babies are born prematurely, they have difficulty breathing because they don't have enough surfactant present in their lungs. And then a third type of cell are white blood cells known as macrophages. Those are the ones that can move around, and they are sort of on patrol around the alveolar sacs to try to catch any bacteria that didn't get caught in the mucus, didn't get filtered out by the nasal hairs, might be still present and able to cause a problem. The macrophages can eat it up and capture it and get rid of that bacteria before it causes an infection. And then we have a diagram showing you, here is the alveoli on the end of a bronchiole and your bronchial tree in your lungs, surrounded by the capillaries, both the arterial side in red and the venous side in blue. Though, of course, we know blood is not really that color. And then a diagram, sort of a cross section, showing your type 1 cell being a very thin, a squamous epithelial cell, and then type 2 cells, the ones that produce the lipid surfactant to keep the alveolar open. And then we have some macrophages here, just kind of floating around, killing off any bacteria that happen to be present. You can see a capillary present here on the left, and so the oxygen and carbon dioxide, is just making this trip back and forth between the bloodstream and your airway at the alveolar sacs. So check for your understanding. Do you know the answers to these three questions? If you find yourself not quite able to answer that, then you might want to go back and review this video. But can you identify the most important structures in the upper and lower respiratory tract? Can you discuss how airborne pathogens are trapped and eliminated at the various places, various stages along the respiratory system? And can you describe how swallowing food and breathing air safely occurs in the same physical space, that being the pharynx at the back of your throat? So this finishes the brief overview of the structure and function of your respiratory system.